Good morning to those of you in the West, and good afternoon just to those of you in the East. We're very pleased to welcome you to the NRI Author Spotlight, which is part of the kickoff of the NARUC Summer Policy Summit. We try to bring significant books on regulation to the regulatory community. We're really pleased to have Professor Paul Joskow making a presentation today. Catherine, can I have the next slide, please? Just quickly about NRI, we are the National Regulatory Research Institute. We're the research arm of the nation's public utility commissions. We were formed in 1976. And basically, we perform three functions. We do research, long-term research. We provide direct assistance to regulatory commissions, and we do education and training. As part of the education and training, we've initiated the Regulatory Training Initiative, which is a remote training platform. We've had a number of courses. We will be sending all of you more information about the courses that we are going to be holding in the fall. We've got a really interesting lineup, including courses on resource adequacy, Telecom 101, and the design of capacity markets. So hopefully you'll be joining us for those courses. And but let's get back to the business at hand, which is Professor Paul Joskow. Let me give you a little layout of what's going to happen today. Professor Joskow is going to give a brief talk. He and I are going to have a bit of a dialogue, some questions, and then we're soliciting questions from the audience. And Catherine, do we have a slide that indicates how people can ask questions? Yes.
So there's a question bar that's available at the top of your screen. You'll see it and it will pop out. And if you feel like asking a question, you can do so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So ask questions in the question bar, and then we'll go through the questions, and I'll ask the questions to Professor Joskow. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor Joskow, because he's had a tremendous career, and still does have a tremendous career in terms of contributing to the economics of regulation. But he comes at this from, I think, a different perspective than many of us do, because he's not only an expert on the economics of regulation, but he's also an expert on the economics of antitrust and many other areas. But it's an interesting melding of those two, which makes much of his work such a pleasure to read, because it covers so much ground, and it's so erudite. Professor Joskow is the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics Emeritus at MIT. He's been at MIT off and on since the early 70s as a member of the faculty, after he received his PhD from Yale University. Of course, I like to think that his real intellectual framing was at Cornell, showing my own bias there, and in particular because his advisor at Cornell was Alfred Kahn. Now, I hope that Professor Joskow is going to say a few words about Alfred Kahn, but he was the former chairman of the New York Commission, which was only one of his many significant achievements. But what's relevant for us today is that the book Markets for Power is really part of a continuum of books that started out, I would say, with Alfred Kahn's two-volume set on the economics of regulation, where he really started to delve into issues of what markets would look like and methods of efficient pricing and things of that sort. Um, the other books that were very significant were some of the books that were written by current Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer with Paul McAvoy. So at any rate, the book that we're hearing about today is very significant in starting or being a stepping stone in the intellectual conversation about whether or not the electric utility industry should be transformed from the vertically integrated, or how it could be transformed from the vertically integrated status that it developed under, and what some of the many questions would be associated with that. Well, I could go on and on about Professor Joskow, but I think that the best thing that I could do is for him to go on about his book and his story. So with that, Professor Joskow, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carl. I'm going to share my screen. I don't usually look back on publications, but when Carl suggested that I come and give a talk, kind of looking back and looking forward on markets for power, it seemed like a worthwhile thing to do, because I had actually just reread it, violating my normal policy of never reread something after you've published it. But I reread it because I began seeing references to it in more recent papers, and some of the references I didn't actually recall. We started working on this project in almost exactly 40 years ago. I'm going to talk about how we came to do it. Dick Schmalensky and I were recently tenured professors at MIT, and the book was published sometime in 1983 by MIT Press, and it was an analysis of potential strategies for electric utility restructuring and deregulation, and we called it Markets for Power. We have a subsequent book, by the way, about cap and trade systems for emissions, which is called Markets for Clean Air. So that's a kind of title we like. So there's a picture of the cover of the book from 1983. That's Dick and me, probably around 1981 or 1982, when we had less road wear than we have now. Both of us now have very gray hair, as you can see in my case. And what I'd like to talk about is, first of all, how we came to write the book. And I want to talk about the economic context in which we began this project, because it's very different from the way things are today. And my guess is many of you here today were either too young to remember what it was like in the very early 1980s, or weren't even born yet. And it played an important role in the evolution of this industry, and also the associated policy and regulatory context and how it changed. I'll then touch on what's actually in the book. I sometimes say this book is frequently cited and rarely read because it's cited for all kinds of things that aren't there. And I'll tell you what is there and what's not there. I'll talk a little bit about what we got right and what we got wrong. And finally, I'd like to look forward and just very briefly identify 3 or 4 areas of future work on continuing to evolve wholesale electricity markets and retail pricing in the US. So the economic context in around 1980, some of you may remember it, but there were huge cost overruns and poor operating performance for nuclear plants. There were cost overruns and poor operating performance for large baseload coal plants. There were restrictions on the use of natural gas in new utility generating plants under the Power Plant Industrial Fuel Use Act of 1978 and 79, and a requirement that existing plants cease using natural gas by 1990. That law was eventually repealed in 1987, but natural gas was not readily available for new utility boilers. Moreover, there were natural gas shortages due to historical regulation by the Federal Power Commission and subsequently FERC of field prices of natural gas below their market value, which led to to natural gas shortages, and a gradual deregulation was not completed until about 1990. Interest rates were very high, which impacted utilities. High rates of inflation, so regulatory lag was a big issue. There was stagnant economic growth. Electricity demand was growing much more slowly than had been forecast. Utilities had financing issues, especially if they were building nuclear plants that were taking longer and costing more than had been anticipated. And there were rapidly rising retail electricity rates, which put pressure on state public utility commissions. And just a note, well, kind of most of the most aggressive restructuring that took place in the late 1990s through 2000, 2001 were in the states that had the highest retail rates. Texas is actually an exception. So just, I'll flip through some data. You can see, just keep your eye on 1980, annual inflation rate of almost 15%, interest rate on federal funds over 20%, real crude oil prices in today's dollars were $140 a barrel in 1980. People were miserable, so they constructed what they called a misery index, which added together inflation and unemployment. And you can see that at the end of the Carter administration and in the middle of the Ford administration, there was a lot of misery reflecting these factors. And I should note, 1974, 75, 1979, 1980 were both periods when there were dislocations in world oil markets due to events in the Persian Gulf. I'd done some research in the 80s on nuclear plant construction costs, and as you can see, those kept going up, and there were large cost overruns. There have been a variety of studies of learning by doing. That is, as you produce a product, more and more of it, you get better at it. You add innovations of one type or another, and the typical learning curve declines over time. And that's certainly true of wind generators and solar generators today. But this is a study for nuclear, and there's no learning by doing. I guess maybe it's unlearning by doing, but costs just kept escalating. And it's not just the construction costs which people focus on. These plants work very poorly. So if you go back to 1980, this is the capacity factor of these plants. These days, we think nuclear plants on average have 90+ capacity factors. Well, they were very, very low then. The result of this was that the combination of high construction costs and relatively low production made the electricity from these plants very expensive. Same was true for coal. Large coal plants, the costs rose in real terms. And again, the performance of these plants declined. It took a long time for US constructors of coal power plants to master supercritical, there's very high temperature and pressure technology, and to do it at large scales. And the availability of these units was much lower than would have been economical, but it also was declining as power plants increased in size, reflecting the difficulties of exploiting scale economies. And the end result, these are residential retail rates on average. These are average retail rates on average. If we look at the average, in 1974, they were under 7 cents a kilowatt hour on average. And in 1980, they'd risen to about 11 cents a kilowatt hour. So over a 50%, roughly a 50% increase in prices over a period of time of 10 years. Let me turn now to the policy context, and here I will mention Fred Kahn. This is the period in which there was massive deregulation of many industries in the US, starting in the Carter administration in the late 1970s. The first major move was the deregulation of airlines. And Fred Kahn, as Carl indicated, he was my advisor, undergraduate advisor at Cornell. He was the dean of regulation, the economics of regulation, and he was writing his book while I was a while I was an undergraduate, and it became the book for a period of time that people used in teaching courses on the economics of regulation. He was also an expert in antitrust, which got me interested in both areas. He went on to be the chair of the Public Utility Commission in New York Public Service Commission. He focused on retail rate reform and building an excellent staff. And then President Carter invited him to become the chair of the Civil Aeronautics Board, which was responsible for regulating prices and entry for airlines. And he initiated fairly quickly a deregulation program, even before Congress formally deregulated the industry. And it was followed by deregulation of trucking in 1980. Actually, Darius Gaskins was the chair of the ICC at that time, and he had worked for Fred Kahn in the Civil Aeronautics Board. Then railroads with the Staggers Act in 1980, telecommunications through actions by the Federal Communications Commission, but most importantly, the antitrust laws, which as a result of an antitrust case brought by the Department of Justice, it broke up AT&T over a period of years in the 1980s and opened up that industry to competition. PURPA was passed in 1978, although it really didn't come into force until around 1980 when the courts clarified things. It, I think, looking back, was ultimately a can opener that helped to push a program of entry of independent power producers into the market. It took a while, but that was the can opener that started it. I mentioned the Power Plant Industrial Fuel Use Act. The Clean Air Act amendments of 1978 and 79 also placed new requirements for new source performance standards for new power plants. And then Ronald Reagan became president. The administration's changed. He was sworn in on January 20th, 1981. And he was also a proponent of deregulation in his administration. However, he didn't have that much more to do. And he focused on deregulating the field price of natural gas, ending shortages, and actually reducing over time the price of natural gas, and supported the industry restructuring that took place during the 1980s as well, that unraveled the web of long-term contractual arrangements and restrictions on natural gas supplies. And these events, the economic context, the policy context, put a lot of pressure on state regulatory commissions to control costs. And it led ultimately to restructuring, especially in the states with the highest retail rates. PURPA created a lobby for going further. If you could build a big cogeneration plant in Southern California, why couldn't you just build a regular power plant? And why was it only utilities who got to build these things? So the IPP industry, heavily influenced by Enron's lobbying, put a lot of pressure in a number of states to restructure and allow competition in both the generation segment and also in the retail supply segment. And then in the late 1980s, the UK began to restructure its electric power industry, completing it around 1990. And as I'll discuss, it followed one of the scenarios that we discussed, but more importantly, it became a model for others to look at. In the early 1990s, I know the commissioners of the California Public Utility Commission went to England, visited with the regulators, with Ofgem and with the people in the industry, and were very impressed with what they saw. And the ultimate proposals, the two blue books that came out, were heavily influenced by what had gone on in England. So that's the table of contents of the book. It's not a very long book. It's about 220 pages. And it's organized in just a way that I like to do research. The first third of the book is really a careful discussion and assessment of the organization of the electric power industry in the US as it stood in 1980. Primarily among the IOUs, vertically integrated regulated monopolies. We go into some detail about the internal functions that are accomplished inside a vertically integrated utility. My economic interests extend beyond classical economics. I'm quite interested in the economics of organizations and internal organization. I've written many papers on contracts. And I think we recognize importantly that if you were going to break up this industry in one way or another, you had to find market mechanisms to reproduce many of these functions, some of which were fairly esoteric for many economists, spinning reserves, frequency regulation, and so on. We looked at the strengths and weaknesses of the existing system in terms of short-run efficiency, the economics of dispatching, maintaining, and making generators available, long-run cost efficiency, primarily investments, controlling construction and financing costs. We looked at price efficiencies and inefficiencies and long-run price efficiencies and inefficiencies. And as I said, it was kind of it's a comparative institutional analysis. It starts from where we were, and then it's going to explore a variety of alternative institutional arrangements and what we expect the consequences would be in terms of the efficiency metrics that we discussed in the first third of the book or so. And just some general conclusions from where we saw the electric power industry in the early 1980s. We thought that, at least in theory, there could be substantial short-run benefits, but they were likely to be fairly small from more efficient dispatch of the system, especially if the tight pools, as they had in the Northeast, were expanded. And we said maybe 1 or 2% of total revenues could be saved by more economic dispatching. We conclude there were too many very small vertically integrated utilities to achieve economies of scale and economies of coordination. We conclude that regulatory incentives to control operating and construction costs were poor, that there were potential improvements in long-run efficiency, and those were likely to be large, and these were to better control of construction costs, better control of operating performance, technology choice, and innovation. And as most economists continue to conclude, retail rates were poorly aligned with the right economic signals. But in much of what in our book, we assume that distribution and retail rates would continue to be regulated except for large customers. So we kind of missed retail competition except for very large customers. So scenario one, I should say that in how we came to write this book, that was the context. An official from the Department of Energy came to see Dick and me, and shortly after January of 1981, and said, well, why can't we just deregulate the electric power industry like we've done in all these other industries? And we said, wait, that's not so. This isn't like airlines. It's not like trucks. This industry has a lot of attributes where you can't just say to everybody, every regulator, stop regulating, let everyone charge what they want. And he said, okay, well, why don't you go through and analyze this, because my boss is really very interested in moving on to this important industry. And he got here too late to deregulate all those other industries, but he wants to deregulate this one. So our first scenario is complete deregulation without any restructuring. That is the solution that was originally proposed to us. And we conclude that would be very, very burdensome. There would be a lot of market power, horizontal market power, vertical market power, very high prices. And eventually, perhaps there'd be entry, but it would take a long period of time unless other changes were made. The second scenario was a bit of an advance on the first, which was just, well, why can't we just deregulate wholesale transactions between vertically integrated utilities? And one of the things we discussed in the first part of the book is the fact that even back then, there were wholesale markets. They were mostly short-term markets, economy energy markets, where utilities traded energy supplies on an hourly basis based on differences in their marginal generation costs. In pools like the New England pool and in PJM, there was also an informal capacity market. these are mostly bilateral arrangements. They were not organized in any way, but there was plenty of trading that was going on. In this scenario, there's no forced restructuring. Distribution rates continue to be regulated. We recognize there had to be access to transmission if competitive wholesale suppliers were going to be able to compete. We thought there would probably be expanded reliance on larger pooling and coordination entities, kind of, we didn't call it an ISO, it was kind of like an ISO. It would have allowed independent power producers to enter, but the question is who would buy their power? This had already been a problem in the early 1980s where PERPA generators were having trouble finding markets for their services in some states, even though there were obligations on incumbent utilities to buy. We recognize that there were legacy arrangements that had to be taken into account. I guess we didn't think up the word stranded costs and stranded benefits, but this was clearly an issue we recognized was going to have to be handled. We saw a web of contracts. We focused on contractual arrangements, medium-term and long-term contractual arrangements between systems and potential new IPPs. And we concluded that if you can go this route, you're going to have a lot of problems with horizontal and vertical market power without further restructuring. And the third scenario, we actually do some restructuring. We separate distribution from generation and transmission, and as in scenario 2, introduce wholesale market competition. Generation's deregulated, again with legacy transition arrangements. Distribution companies now have to rely on competitive procurement from wholesale markets for incremental generating capacity. They couldn't build it, they had to buy it. We did not expect that they could rely entirely on spot markets to finance the investments. And I remind you, at that point in time, it was before the availability of natural gas, before combined cycles, and we were focused on what was being built then, which were large nuclear and coal plants, which took 8, 10, 12 years to build and were quite expensive. And we didn't see it being possible to finance those based on spot market arrangements. And in fact, nobody's built a nuclear power plant in a liberalized market in the US or actually anywhere else on Earth without some kind of a long-term purchase power agreement. We spent a lot of time analyzing potential market power concerns if there wasn't also restructuring of generation, that is divestiture. We look at concerns about vertical market power, and we assume that both the transmission rates but also access would be regulated by FERC, and we envisioned open access tariffs of some type. We also saw this evolving into an endogenous restructuring where generators and buyers and sellers and transmission entities saw opportunities to economize by merging. And this is not unlike, well, if you look at where we are now, I mean, ISO New England is basically what the old New England Power Pool was. ISO New York is what the old New York Power Pool was. PJM has expanded west and added additional areas. And MISO and SPP are new ISOs which perform many functions that were not performed before. And we just see that this has actually been happening. We talk very little in the book about the details of short-term markets. We realize there'd have to be some bidding and brokering mechanism to complement cost-based economic dispatch. But we were very heavily influenced by the experience in the New England Power Pool and PJM with centralized economic dispatch for all of the generators in the system. And we just kind of thought, well, there'd be some kind of bidding mechanism as long as the market was competitive that would reproduce these economic dispatch curves, and that just wasn't going to be a big deal. And as I'll indicate in a moment, we were obviously wrong about that. And again, in this scenario, we didn't anticipate retail competition except for very large customers who we assumed would purchase directly in the bulk market. And finally, the fourth scenario is very much like the first, except it completely restructures vertically. We have complete vertical disintegration, independent generators and independent transmission owners and developers. And we envisioned actually transcos forming, transmission companies, like those that have formed across most of, in the UK and most of the EU. They'd be regulated, they'd have open access, and they would have coordination mechanisms to coordinate both short-term operations and also long-term investments. So we had a lot of emphasis here on transmission consolidation and coordination, and also on horizontal market power concerns at the generation level. And we conclude this scenario by suggesting that if you really wanted to restructure and get a competitive market, you couldn't just wait for generators to knock on the door, that was going to take too long, and that we needed to have a divestiture of generating companies that had large market shares. And there's quite a bit of analysis of that in the book. So what we get right and what we get wrong. I think we got right in our discussion of transitions. It was going to be hard and technically and hard politically to move in this direction. The long-run efficiency gains that we identified from generation competition, I think, have been quite significant, both in controlling construction costs, but also on availability and operating costs of generators. I think we were right that relying only on spot markets to support new investment was not going to be adequate, and it isn't. Every ISO, including ERCOT, has some type of a administrative capacity remuneration mechanism to supplement revenues generated from the energy market. We were right that FERC open access transmission was going to be required. I think we were right that there were going to be benefits from larger coordination, dispatch, bidding, and brokering entities, and these are like the ISOs we have now. I think we were right that retail rate designs were unlikely to change much if they continued to be regulated, all the constraints that they were under. And regulation hasn't gone away, but it's certainly the domain has been reduced. So what we get wrong? Well, I think we way underestimated the challenges of short-run wholesale market design, LMP and all that. And it's a bit of ironic. It's a little ironic because we knew Fred Schweppe, who was a professor in electrical engineering at MIT, and he was working on locational marginal pricing. And he wrote a book called Spot Pricing of Electricity. And we had arguments with him when he was working on that about, could you really finance any of this with spot markets? And he thought you could, and we thought you couldn't. And we ended up largely ignoring this. I think we overestimated the need for complex long-term contracts to support investment in generation. And I think that's because we were focused on large baseload coal and nuclear plants, and cheap natural gas, readily available combined cycle technology was not on the horizon. And that has really helped a lot to make competition more vibrant. I already mentioned that Purple was a can opener that got this going, because first there were cogenerators, and then there were cogenerators that did as little cogeneration as possible, and soon we had IPPs. And once they got inside the house, they decided they want to occupy all the bedrooms. As I said, we paid no attention to retail competition. I think we overestimated horizontal market power problems for the same reasons, the focus on entry of large coal and nuclear plants. We didn't foresee deregulation of natural gas, or again, two of my colleagues at that time, Paul McAvoy and Bob Pindyke, were doing lots of research showing why we should deregulate the field price of natural gas. But this has made this a new ball game. Hope for retail rate reform really hasn't progressed as far as we'd hoped. And I should note, decarbonization was not on the horizon at that point, so we don't discuss windmills and solar generators or batteries in the book. So what was the impact of this publication? Well, not much at that time, I would say. I mean, this came out in 1983. It got some nice reviews, but it didn't set the world on fire. And quite frankly, Dick and I, who were, in our prime research age, we went on, we worked on other things. I didn't write another paper on restructuring and competition until about 1990. And what changed all of this for me anyway, and for Dick, was what happened in the UK. The restructuring that looked very much like our scenario number 4, and the attention that was attracting, not so much in Europe at that time, but was beginning to attract in the US. Analytical papers were appearing in journals. I had a number of PhD students who studied the pricing in what was then the pool in the UK, and that really enlivened discussion of this. And so our book was did not dramatically change direction at that time. Okay, let me switch to looking forward. I just have 4 areas I think are important. The first is short-term wholesale market design to accommodate deep penetration of intermittent generation storage. And this is under the assumption that we're going to deeply decarbonize the electricity sector, at least in some areas of the country. The ISOs in those areas and the large vertically integrated utilities are well aware of this, and they're working on these issues, because the basic underlying model for generation dispatch and reliability is fundamentally different with a system dominated by wind, solar, and storage than it is by a system that is primarily dispatchable generation. Second, mechanisms to support efficient investments in wind, solar, and storage to meet decarbonization commitments in the absence of a compatible price on carbon emissions. And not having a price on carbon emissions, or a price that's consistent and compatible with the commitments that are being made by many states, I think really makes this much harder to do. But at least to me, there's growing evidence that to meet these deep decarbonization commitments, we're back to long-term contracts again, PPAs, and there are a lot of people working on this now. They're called hybrid markets, and I just participate in a conference in Europe where I think they're a little bit further ahead. Planning and compensation reforms to support investments to expand intra and interregional transmission capacity, to facilitate efficient exploitation, investment, and market integration of wind and solar resources, I think is really very important. I have a paper you can find on my website that I put up there a few weeks ago on this, comparing the US and Europe and how we're approaching this problem. But the basic problem is, to oversimplify it, of course, is that the best wind and solar resources are located in places like the Great Plains, areas of Wyoming for wind, select along the East Coast, from Maine to North Carolina. The best solar resources are in the South, especially the Southwest. And those are not areas where there's a lot of traditional dispatchable generation supporting infrastructure, and it tends to be located fairly far from load centers. So if you really want to get the best, most economical wind and solar resources and utilize them efficiently as you can, given the large country we live in, substantial additional transmission capacity would be required. And this raises a host of issues and must confront a number of barriers. And then finally, retail rate reforms to induce customers to take advantage of changing wholesale price distributions due to penetration of wind and solar. And, I think the way one has to look at this is the decarbonization strategies we're looking at are not just decarbonization of the electricity sector. It's decarbonization of other sectors of the economy, often by switching to electricity. Electric vehicles are the easiest examples, buildings, and so on. And prices provide the signals that consumers need to take advantage of electricity effectively. And the current retail rate structures, especially for smaller residential and commercial industrial customers, don't do that. There are all kinds of issues here that have to be addressed. There are political issues, there are income distribution issues, but strengthening these linkages are going to be very important. In work I'm doing with colleagues at MIT, we show that in a close to fully decarbonized electricity sector, that the future wholesale price distribution looks very different from what it does today. There are lots of hours when prices are zero or close to zero, and then a few hours when they're really high. And if you want to give incentives for owners of electric vehicles, for example, to charge up their cars during the middle of the day in a state like California with abundant solar resources when prices are low, and not to charge their cars up from 4 to 8 p.m. in the evening, especially in the summer months when the sun goes down and prices are very high. But right now, those signals aren't being sent. And then there are issues with moving from a system where we had a mix of generation and fuel costs to recover from ratepayers to a system where most of the costs are going to be fixed costs. The marginal cost of running a wind turbine or a generator close to zero. Batteries are much more complicated. There are charging and discharging costs and round cycle efficiencies that vary depending on the technology, but they're quite different from where we are today. I know Dick and I both believe that putting more of these costs into fixed charges from an economist perspective would be ideal. From a political perspective, it's not clear. And let me conclude there. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see someone. There we go.
Thank you. That was terrific. I just want to remind everybody how to do questions. We have a question bar. Okay, thank you, Catherine. So please type in some questions in the question bar, and we'll be happy to ask them if we have an opportunity, and we'll pass them on. But let me start out with the questions, and my question, at least my initial question, is based upon some of the questions that you've had in the book, because I think you had great questions that you asked as you went along, and I don't know if this was to encourage conversation or because it was part of a discussion or written in part to encourage students to think out of the box and things of that sort. And one of the areas that you discuss in the book early on is natural monopoly, economies of scale, and economies of scope. And obviously, since the days of Insull, the notions of economies of scale have changed. In my mind, economies of scope have become more important. I'd like to get your perspective in terms of how this idea of a natural monopoly, which is based upon economies of scale, has changed over time, and whether or not how economies of scale and economies of scope will affect the future of both electrification and decarbonization. And if you wouldn't mind, since many of the people on are not economists, if you could just differentiate between economies of scale and economies of scope, I think that would be very helpful.
Okay, why don't I start there? Economies of scale means that the average cost decline as a firm gets larger. Economies of scope means that overall cost decline as firms add different additional products to the mix. So just to take another industry, AT&T, prior to restructuring, always argued that its long distance network was a natural monopoly, that it by having a big basically one major network supplier for long distance service, that customers got the most economical provision of that service. They also argued that there were economies of scope. Not only should they provide telephone service, but they should provide telephones and other devices that use the networks. And that was basically their argument against the restructuring. And let me just note that one's view on whether something's a natural monopoly or not is technology dependent. technologies change over time. So AT&T's long distance network, just to stick, it probably was a natural monopoly into the 1950s and 1960s. Maybe there were economies of scope for technical reasons for linking the equipment that use the network with the network together. But by the 1970s, when microwave technology became available, and where any idiot could set up a private telephone network using microwave switches, at the very least, the domain of the natural monopoly contracted. Then even during restructuring of telecommunications, the view was that the local network was a natural monopoly. And I just unwound one of my wife's crazy contracts during this period of time. Competitors could come and lease space on the local network, on my Verizon's network here. And over time, that turned out to no longer be true, because I have two cable companies right on the pole where my telephone is, and 3 is more than one. And I have wireless service that I can draw on. I have 5G now. So that's not a natural monopoly either anymore. Well, I think to some extent the same is true in electricity. When INSA was developing Commonwealth Edison and Middle South Utilities in the early 20th century, there were economies of getting bigger. You could build bigger plants. There's a lot of evidence of declining costs with larger plants, improving efficiency. The coordination mechanisms that we have now devised with some difficulty through the ISO wholesale markets really did not exist. They couldn't have existed. They didn't have the computational capabilities. So the notion you did this internally may have made sense. That's changed. We're not relying on bigger and bigger plants now. We're relying on combined cycles in the fossil realm, which can be built at relatively small scale. Similarly with wind and with solar. But more important, we've developed technologies for coordination. And if there's a natural monopoly still today, I think it has to do with some aspects of local distribution, where I think it would be kind of weird to run another set of wires down my street, but I can still put solar PV on my roof and have storage if I want. And then in the planning and operation of transmission networks, not the ownership of the actual lines. We know we can have many owners of lines as long as they're part of a coordination scheme. But there are economies there, and they're, I think, unexploited economies in some areas. And those economies are going to be more important as we turn to wind and solar, both to plan the transmission necessary to gain access to the best sites, but also to coordinate the operations of these intermittent generation facilities and storage technologies over wider areas. So I think that the domain has shrunk, but there are still some natural monopoly elements in the system. That was a long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm going to skip my follow-up to allow other questions from other folks. My follow-up was, which you might be able to touch on, is what this all means for regulation. But maybe we could pick that up in the roundtable discussion that we're having after this talk. Let me go to this question that you cited. Decarbonization is one of the challenges in a deregulated environment. Could you expand on that?
Well, it's not decarbonization per se. It's the technologies that we're going to rely on for decarbonization. So today, or until recently, the system is built on dispatchable generating plants, whether it's bid-based or it's based on competitive bidding in a wholesale market. Basically, you come up with an economic dispatch curve that basically tells you what the marginal cost or price would be at every output level, and the system operator, as demand and supply vary during the day and from day to day and from season to season, moves up and down the dispatch curve. It's conceptually quite simple. With wind and solar, they're not dispatchable in the traditional sense. They're not sitting there waiting to be called by the system operator. Their production is driven by variations in solar irradiation, and those variations, obviously, the sun doesn't shine at night. It also varies by season. We get less sun in the winter than in the summer. It varies by location. You get more sun in the Southwest than you get in Maine. And it varies with weather, like the weather we've had for the last week here in New England, which is cloudy and rainy. And this what they call variable renewable energy, I call it intermittent. It produces when it can produce, and when it can't produce, it can't produce. And the system operator's function now changes rather dramatically. It must balance these variations, which can occur very, very quickly over wide areas, using either storage or residual fossil generating capacity. Or if you have dispatchable nuclear capacity in the system, or maybe there'll be new dispatchable technologies. But this shift really makes this a much more challenging problem, but not insurmountable, especially with the computation we have. But it's going to involve new products. Fast start generation is going to be important. Storage is going to be really important, and how it's utilized is going to be important.
Very good. Let me follow up with this question because it's along the same theme. In terms of a switch to more resources relying on fixed costs and zero fuel or zero marginal costs, what would you encourage ISOs to think about in the way they structure markets, both real-time and capacity markets? And for that matter, I'll add any other types of markets that need to be developed.
Well, I think the evolution of short-term markets is an evolutionary process. I think the ISOs are recognizing that because of the wide and rapid variations in wind and solar output, that they need to have energy resources, whether it's storage or residual, typically gas generating capacity that can react quickly. They may have to pay generators to be available at particular times to find new products. I think that, let me say something about it. So I said every system, at least in the US, has a capacity remuneration mechanism. Most of the, putting aside the fully regulated, vertically integrated utilities, most of the systems have capacity obligations and capacity markets, and they kind of clean things up and in terms of providing adequate supplemental revenues to cover capital costs. And ERCOT has two capacity supplementary mechanisms as well, the operating reserve demand curve and another curve that I rely on, which gets you under certain circumstances to $9,000 a megawatt hour. The only system I know that doesn't have a capacity remuneration mechanism, an administrative capacity remuneration mechanism, is Alberta. But Alberta, I think they've made up for it because there are market power issues, at least from my perspective in Alberta, which I don't want to get into now, but they have a different competitive standard from the one that's been applied in the US, and maybe it's a better competitive standard. I'm not completely sure. I think as we transition to relying much more on wind, solar, and storage, that the capacity remuneration problem is going to become more and more important because I mean, we've been running simulations, not with $9,000 a megawatt hour as the peak price, but $50,000 a megawatt hour. And you kind of need that price in some regions of the country to deal with the fact that you need scarcity conditions to generate the revenues to support these facilities. But we also know that we're not going to be able to charge customers $50,000 a megawatt hour for some period of time if we're in scarcity conditions. So I think capacity remuneration mechanisms of some type are going to be much more important. I think the most likely evolution is going to be one in which there's more competitive procurement of wind and solar and storage, whether it's mandated by the states or it's managed by companies that have decarbonization commitments. And they'll be entering into PPAs for 10 to 20 years that will provide payments for the capacity that's being provided. And then the operator of the wind and solar and storage facilities will be free to operate in the wholesale market and earn whatever revenues they can from that.
Okay. I think this follows along.
I have a paper on that on my website too.
And if I might say, my experience is that none of your papers are short papers. And when you get done reading one of your papers, you really have both a tremendous understanding of what's going on now, but it's really put in context well. So it's a learning experience, and I encourage everybody to look at your website, which you could find easily by just Googling Paul Joskow, and there's a wealth of information there, and it's just representative of a remarkable career. Let me follow up with this question. Are there any conflicts between increased fixed charges and the ability of variable rates to modify consumer behavior? That is, will higher fixed charges reduce volumetric charges to the point that consumers will be less sensitive to time varying rates?
Well, of course, it depends on how oh, by the way, thank you very much for your comments about my work. I should tell you, I originally thought I'd be an economic historian. And so I like to really understand how things work. But my father convinced me that that was a route to poverty. So I became a regular, more applied economist, but I still have that economic history bug in me to some extent. I think it's a question of rate design. I think the way the prices look to us in a almost fully decarbonized system, with a lot of wind and solar, is you're going to have a lot of very low priced hours. So that becomes more like a subscription. You subscribe for electricity and you use as much as you want because the incremental cost is very low. But then there are going to be hours when the prices are going to be very high, and you want to encourage behavior that moves away from those hours. I gave the example before of when you charge up your electric vehicle or when you cool down your house in the summer. So I think that retail prices will be more variable under that scheme. I think as a practical matter, given the events in ERCOT, with the customers who are on, the small number of customers who are on real-time index tariffs, Gritty was the supplier and is now out of business. I think we're going to have to rely more, not so much on, we need better hedges for customers. It's just not going to fly to have that kind of variation. And we have to remember, real-time prices aren't real-time prices because we like real-time prices. We're trying to influence behavior. So the question is, are there other ways of influencing behavior? And we know that the answer to that is yes. We can hedge a large fraction of the customer's consumption and focus on the margin. We can rely on intermediaries, whether it's a distribution retail supplier or in retail competition states, a competitive supplier, to offer what I'd refer to as load control contract. So I offer you a contract that says, for example, okay, the way this is going to work is I'm going to give you a 10% discount off your current rate. But on 20 days during the year, I'm going to turn off your charger for your electric vehicle between 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock, and you'll have to charge some other time. Or we're going to cycle your air conditioners on a certain number of days a year, or your water heaters. And these kinds of rates, what I call load control rates, they've been around for decades, and they're extremely popular. Customers love air conditioner recycling rates and water heater recycling rates. So I see basically you're giving the signals to the intermediary. The intermediary then structures a contractual arrangement with the end use customer, which rather than subjecting them to a lot of price volatility, in fact, has them give up some control in return to a discount off of the standard rate. And with the wide diffusion of real-time meters, two-way communications, internet capability of appliances, I think down the road these technologies will evolve, and they can be used more effectively to help customers work with retail intermediaries to use their appliances and equipment in the most economical way possible.
Are there any scenarios you can imagine when considering the applicability of resources at the distribution system level in the bulk level markets? In other words, what's the role of distribution in terms of the operation of the bulk markets? And there's a second part of this question. Is there a diminishing return when considering the services provided by distribution system assets, for example, due to their vast numbers, versus the operational infrastructure needed to enable them to participate?
Well, this is a complicated question. I think ideally we would like customer premises equipment, whether it's rooftop PV or fuel cells or storage, to be integrated into the wholesale market. And we'd effectively like customers to be able to sell their output or charge up their batteries and discharge their batteries, and either pay or be paid the wholesale market price adjusted for losses and so on. And now that's going to become more important. The larger, more significant is the diffusion of these resources. But I think it's important, or otherwise they'll be used inefficiently. I'll say something now that I know is controversial. I think that net metering rules in many states are wildly inefficient. They're very good at encouraging solar PV, where grid-based PV would be much more economical, but they does not encourage good behavior, because the combination of net metering and some of the wild rec rules like they have here in Massachusetts are really over-subsidizing those technologies. And study after study has found that large-scale grid-based PV is much cheaper than rooftop PV. And I respect the view that some people have. They'd like to be independent of the grid, but in fact, I think many people in Texas and California discovered when their lights went out that their solar PV didn't work either, unless they had storage and it was wired properly, because it generates a DC. You have an inverter that turns it into AC, and it goes out to the grid, and when the grid's down, you're down. But I think this needs to be thought about carefully. On the other hand, it's not that big a problem in most parts of the U.S. I think the regulators recognize that there are issues with net metering. Among other issues is their income distribution. The way we handle it, net income distribution properties are very bad. They hurt poor people on average. So I think that's another area that needs a real rethink, quite frankly.
I would add Hurricane Sandy to your list of events where customers were surprised that their solar didn't work as well.
My daughter lives in LA, and she has a she has rooftop PV, and she's so excited about how little power she buys from the local utility, which is LADWP. But and she said, and we can continue to run our air conditioners if the lights go. I said, no, you can't. You don't have storage. It doesn't work that way.
Well, as part of paying for capacity question, how will we efficiently and equitably pay for firm power to support the variable generation if the capital cost of firm is large? That is, it's not pure natural gas, but something that is zero carbon and the utilization is low. How much of the incremental cost of clean is the ratepayer responsibility, and how much is the taxpayer responsibility?
Well, this is a deep policy question that starts with, do you want to decarbonize the electricity sector? How fast? How much? But we've been working on models where we look at almost full decarbonization. So we have some gas left in the system. And having a little dispatchable generation, whether it's pure natural gas or natural gas with carbon capture and storage, which doesn't take out 100% of the carbon, by the way, 10 to 20%, it leaves 10 to 20% in the process. It's incredibly valuable, but has very low capacity factors. So it may have a capacity factor of 5%, but you need it when you have events like an extreme weather event that takes out some of your capacity and increases demand. And unlike a battery, unlike a lithium-ion battery, you can run a modern open cycle or CCGT. You can run it for days and days and days. It's a terrific storage device. And I think we're going to see the ISOs kind of purchasing that kind of capacity down the road as a product that they're going to purchase under a longer term contracts. Basically reserve capacity that sits there for 95% of the time, but is available to produce the rest of the time. And the customers will pay. Don't the customers always pay?
Well, generally, sometimes if it's an imprudent investment, shareholders pay. Other times, there are subsidies from the federal government in which, or local governments in which they pay. I think we have time for one more question because we have a hard stop at 1:15. I want to remind everybody that we're returning at 1:30 for a roundtable conversation about issues associated with market design, in particular as it's related to decarbonization. And this question has to do with Enron, and I just want to, for full disclosure with respect to Enron, I spent a lot of time in litigation with Enron post California energy crisis, and was in fact the person that made the Enron tapes public. So having disclosed that, let me just and review the Enron, led the review of the Enron tapes. So here's the question about Enron. It was interesting to see the influence of Enron in Europe in the deregulation path forward. Who do you see now as the major influencers, countries and or companies of our current energy innovations?
Well, on the countries and regulatory side, I would say there's more innovation in Europe right now to support their decarbonization goals than there is in the US. I mean, I'm a big believer in learning from others. I mean, I've visited, I can't tell you how many countries are around the world over time, looking at how their electric power systems are structured, how they're regulated, and so on. And, when things open up again, spending some time with Ofgem in the UK, which really is now in the third iteration of their market design. It's really a great regulatory agency, and they're doing great work to support this decarbonization initiative. I don't think there's any company like Enron now. I mean, Enron did what Enron did, but it really was very aggressive in lobbying for its view that we should restructure the industry and allow competitive generation and competitive retail supply. And they had a big retail supply subsidiary, which I'm not sure if it ever made any money, but it was there. So I don't think I can think of anyone, but in particular, but I think the renewable energy organizations are pretty powerful, and I think state commissions like the California Public Utility Commission and the New York Public Service Commission are kind of out there and grappling with these with these issues. And again, I think it would be conserve on people's time and analysis to look to them in terms of some of the things that they've been doing. You know, California, if you go to their website, they've been having workshops on resource adequacy since 2001, and they're now developing with the cooperation of the ISO techniques for how you value capacity from wind and solar and batteries and wind plus batteries and solar plus batteries. And this is really right on the frontier, and it requires very different kind of analysis than we're used to doing, more complex probabilistic analysis. And we should be looking to places where they're doing that kind of work and not reinvent the wheel. And I'd be looking at Ofgem for transmission planning. I'd be looking at a European organization called ENSO, which does transmission planning, indicative planning, and identification of projects for all of Europe, including interconnections with Northern Africa and Turkey. And I'd be looking to commissions like the California Commission, the New York Commission, and to the ISOs, which have a lot of technical capabilities for leadership in this area.
Well, thank you very much. As I indicated, we're going to take a 15-minute break now, and we're going to reconvene for a roundtable conversation about market design. And I hope that you will all return and join us for that next session. And Professor Joskow has kindly agreed to join us with that. And so thank you very much. For those of you who don't join us, please have a wonderful day and enjoy and learn from the rest of the policy summit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay.